drove through Palestine, took Jerusalem, drove on to Damascus, cracked the Turkish hold over these countries. The Arabs were a sort of adjunct, sort of guerrilla arm of this in Transjordan, led by Lawrence. Lawrence wanted to be paid off more handsomely than he was. He thought that the superpowers had cheated the Arabs out of what he had promised them. But Lawrence had made promises, but these generals were more hard-headed. So the French and the British made a deal to divide up the areas that they had taken between them. The British took Palestine and Transjordan, the French got Syria and Lebanon. And the French had always been involved in Syria and Lebanon from Crusader days. And the church had always been very strong in those places, and the French saw themselves as protectors of the church. So in the 1920s to the 40s, that's the situation that obtained. But after the Second World War, where the British and the French had been really almost destroyed, they were not strong enough to hold on to these areas. And slowly these areas, through the UN help and otherwise, spun into independence. So you got really, in the course of this period, trusteeships from the League of Nations that were given to the French and the British in Iraq, in Transjordan, in Palestine, in Syria, and in Lebanon and so on. And slow independence. Lebanon, I think, was early on, and Egypt, quasi-independent until the monarchy was overthrown, then totally independent in the 50s. Then the British tried to come back in the Suez campaign to take the Suez Canal back, and with the defeat of that in the what was called the Sinai War, that was around 1956. Egypt really, under the new Egypt nationalist movement, Nasser and others, became totally independent. Nasser didn't survive the Yom Kippur War, rather the Six-Day War, very long, because his heart obviously had been weakened and he died suddenly. And the modern situation of his successors, Sadat and Mubarak, is what you're seeing now. So in any event, all these countries are called Ottoman successor states. And that's what some people don't realize. These countries have just been created recently. People talk about Iraq like it's been there for centuries. It's not been there for centuries. If it's been there for 75 years, you're lucky. In other words, it's a modern state of some kind cobbled together by people at various stages after the First World War. And originally, before the Second World War, under British mandate. A mandate, the Iraq mandate, was given to the British by the League of Nations. The mandate was something that the League of Nations, the predecessors of the UN, gave countries on the idea that they were going to try to prepare them for independence over time. There was a Kenya mandate, a Tanganyika mandate. There were a lot of mandates in East Africa as well as the Middle East. They were called Class A mandates and Class B mandates. Class A mandates were someone who was going to get independence quicker. Class B mandates was going to take a long time. And there was a mandate for Palestine, and to the mandate for Palestine was appended the Balfour Declaration, where in the middle of the First World War, His Majesty's government had promised the Jewish community in London in a letter that they would look with favor on the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine once they had got things going. So whether that was good or bad or plus or minus, all that was part of these mandates. And we've seen the result of that now. So to go to Iraq at the present day, the people trying to hold it together as a sacrosanct entity are really looking at a maelstrom there, which doesn't really have a long historical background to it. And the people who never got a mandate and never got anything from anyone are the Kurds. And no one even knew there was a Kurd. I'm sure most of you, before 5 years ago, never even heard there were Kurds. And didn't even know that a Kurd existed. So the Kurds were, because of British manipulation and the oil situation in northern Iraq, manipulated out of everything. The Turks didn't want to give the Kurds anything because there were large portions of eastern Turkey were actually Kurdish. just as other parts were Armenian and other parts had been Greek. In other words, the Turks really didn't have a unified country there, and they wanted one. They certainly didn't want to give the Kurds anything. The Iranians had Kurds in western Iran. They didn't want to give them anything. And Iraq, under the British and the administration that they developed through the Sunnis there, didn't want to give the Kurds anything because that's where all the oil was. So that's where the situation we presently face, and you have a southern Iraq that's been Shiite since the days of Ali and his family. You have a northern Iraq that's Kurdish and a central Iraq that's Sunni, and if you'd taken these courses 10 years ago, you would have already known it. What they're going to finally do is mess it all up, obviously. I have no idea what the end is going to be, but I don't see that as a viable country. And it's going to be a hotbed of terrorism for years to come. And the Bush people just didn't do their homework, just don't know the history, and had no idea what their plan was when they went in there. They thought they were just going to be greeted like heroic liberators and everything would be fine and the people would work it all out. But as it turns out, everything isn't fine and the whole place is in a deteriorating state of chaos. So the Americans will do what they did in Vietnam, pull out and run, and the whole thing will be still in a cauldron. I have no idea what the result will be, but that's the struggle background there. That's from the perspective that I can give you. Maybe there's a different one that you can get yourself, but I don't see what factors would be much different. Well, what part of the world haven't we covered? So the Ottoman Empire persisted on to the First World War. There was even a sultan who had all the trappings of being a caliphate. But then when the Young Turks, a party of army officers, felt that Turkey was being reduced back to the Anatolian mainland and felt that the sultan had become totally incapable of dealing with the modern world, they overthrew the sultan in the early 1900s, even before the First World War, and put this Young Turk regime in power. And only kept him, like the previous people had kept the caliph as a figurehead, and then they finally even overthrew him as a figurehead. And after the First World War, with the triumph to some extent of the Turks over the British to some extent, not altogether, the British took all the areas in the Middle East from them, but in the Dardanelles they were unsuccessful. Kemal Ataturk, the famous Turkish commander at the Battle of the Dardanelles and elsewhere, took over the country. And he called himself Ataturk. That's the name he took. His name was actually Mustafa Kemal, and he took the name Ataturk. And he's become almost a saint in modern Turkey, father of the Turks. And he created the Turkish nation, abolished its alphabet, Arabic alphabet, brought modern European letters into Turkey. If you visited Turkey, which you have, it's all written in English or Western European characters. And